la sessione con il professor ZUCCHERO e il professor Domenic BENEVENTI. The title of the session is Italian Canadian Literature, 30 Years of Literary and Cultural Representations of an Existence in Transit. So everybody please take a seat. And the chair of the session is Professor Lianne Moyes of Université de Montréal, and she will take it over from here.
Welcome to this first session entitled Italian Canadian Literature, 30 Years of Literary and Cultural Representations of an Existence in Transit. My name is Lianne Moyes. I'm a professor at the Université de Montréal, and it's my very great pleasure and my honor really to be asked to chair this session. I'm very grateful to those at the table prior to this session for their initiative and inspiration in bringing me into this field of scholarship and literary creativity. So, without further, I want to introduce both of our speakers, and I think I'll introduce both of them now, and then we'll hold questions till after the two papers. Jim ZUCCHERO is instructor and academic counselor at King's University College at the University of Western Ontario. Well, it was University of Western Ontario when I went there, but I think it's now called Western University. He earned a PhD in English at Western. He has published creative nonfiction and essays on Italian-Canadian writers. He co-edited Reflections on Culture in 2010, and 2 volumes of Beyond Barbed Wire, one devoted to essays and one devoted to creative works. Domenic BENEVENTI, our second speaker, is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Sherbrooke. He is co-editor of Contested Spaces, Counter-Narratives and Culture from Below, which is forthcoming from the University of Toronto Press, and of Queer Frontiers, a special issue of Canadian literature, as well as the edited collection Adjacencies, Minority Writing in Canada with Guernica. His research interests and publications are in Canadian and Quebec literatures, urban writing, representations of gendered, queer, racialized, and class bodies in urban space. So I'm going to pass la parole, as we say in French, to Jim, whose title is 30 Years of Italian-Canadian Writing. And I'll give a little signal at 15 minutes so you know you've got 5.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to present my paper and for all their hard work in organizing this conference. Sincere thanks to the Padula organizing committee for their warm hospitality. I'd also like to thank 2 family members who have accompanied me, my mother, who's here, and my daughter, Isabel. And I have a brief abstract. I'm going to present my paper in English because I'm afraid if I tried to do it in Italian, it would make even less sense. But I do have an abstract in Italian, so if you'd like a copy of that, just raise your hand and I will ask my lovely and talented assistant, Isabel, to distribute that for me. I'm honored to present this first paper at this conference, and I've approached it in the hope of setting out some useful considerations for what lies ahead over the next few days and perhaps over the next 30 years. This paper had its genesis in thinking about a publication to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers. As so often happens, my reach exceeded my grasp. I couldn't complete this analysis in time to meet that deadline. but I have continued to reflect on a few key questions. First, what has the AICW accomplished since it was founded in 1986, and how? Second, what has the impact of that been? What effects and responses have been generated? What are the key issues and challenges, successes and complaints? How has the terrain for writing, publishing, and criticizing this work changed over the past 30 years? Third, what lies ahead? What are the future prospects for Italian-Canadian writing and for this Association of Writers? What should we aspire to accomplish over the next 30 years? What will the critical issues be? Engaging in such predictions is a daunting task if we consider that 30 years ago, there was no internet, no email, no Google or Wikipedia, and only heads of state had cell phones. Finally, what does it matter, or does it matter, that this literature and criticism in general, and Italian-Canadian writing in particular, last? I think they do matter, and I will explain why. So I'll try to unpack my responses to these questions in the next 20 minutes. Let me begin by setting out several broad assertions. I would assert that there were three key ingredients that were crucial to the development of the AICW and Italian-Canadian writing in its early years, from 1986 to about 2000. Those key ingredients were provided in large measure by three key individuals, namely Joseph Pivato, Antonio D'Alfonso, and Pier Giorgio Di Cicco. Each of them contributed talents that together nurtured the growth of the organization and Italian-Canadian writing in its crucial infancy. I'll examine their contributions in greater detail momentarily. In the latter 15 years, several significant shifts have occurred. Specifically, the group of active writers has expanded considerably, and women writers have taken a leading role in guiding the work of this association and producing much of its best writing. The range and caliber of the writing have developed in positive ways. Writing about the immigrant experience is no longer the primary focus of our writing. Now it embraces a much more diverse range of topics and experiences and treats them in more complex ways. Domenic's paper to follow will provide evidence of this. The conditions for Italian-Canadian writing have changed, but writing and publishing continues to pose significant challenges. Italian-Canadians have gained ground in terms of social status. Many of us now write from positions of privilege. Still, it is not easy. Most writers are also teachers, social workers, lawyers, professors, editors, journalists, urban planners, illustrators, not to mention wives, mothers, fathers, and nonas. Still, they make time to write. Obviously, developments in technology and communication have fundamentally changed the mechanics of what we do. We can explore this point more if time permits. I would also assert that the relationship between creative and critical writing is central to understanding Italian-Canadian writing and provides important insights into its development and distinctiveness. In a word, hybridity is its defining feature. It is evident in both the writers themselves and in the works we have produced. This point merits close attention, and I will return to it later. First, let me make my case for the three key ingredients of our success and the writers who have played key roles. In brief, it required much hard work, a certain renegade spirit, and a mystical vision to arrive where we are today. What follows are three very brief profiles of these three key figures. I could take up my whole talk discussing them, but I'd rather move on to other points. I would point out, however, that each of these three have been involved at various times with both creative and critical writing. Joseph Pivato has been widely recognized as the founding father of Italian-Canadian writing, and justly so. In 1986, Pivato was instrumental in the creation of the association and became its founding president. Steady, reliable, tireless, he has embodied the kind of work ethic and diligence that every successful organization needs. Francesco Luigio asserted that cataloging was the first task in establishing the presence of Italian-Canadian writing. Then, quote, the more embarrassing and inconvenient task of criticism could begin. Pivato has undertaken both those tasks and has pursued them relentlessly for nearly 40 years. He was born near Venice, moved to Canada as a young child, excelled at school, completed his PhD at the University of Alberta in 1977, and eventually took a position teaching at Athabasca University. From there, he began to engage and confront the academy as one of their own. Pavato was among the first to recognize that Italian Canadians and Italian Canadian writing is distinctive and merits close attention. He has made it his life work to promote and support that assertion. His most noteworthy contribution may be his seminal and pioneering writing about minority literatures in Canada and internationally. His early collections of critical essays, Contrasts in 1985 and Echo in 1994, were among the first substantive critical writing to examine the work of Italian-Canadian writers like Paci, Di Michele, Edwards, and Pier Giorgio Di Cicco, and others writing from the so-called margins. Since then, he has edited collections on many of these writers. In 1998, Pavato edited the Anthology of Italian-Canadian Writing, an important text that showcases the work of more than 50 writers of Italian heritage. He pointed out that Italian-Canadian writing began in 1653 with writing of F.G. Bressani, a missionary. He suggested that Roman candles in 1978 was the first self-conscious realization about our writing. His poems were included in that edition, and many of his essays constitute the distinctiveness of Italian-Canadian writing and how it contributes to broader conversations about multiculturalism in Canada. His work has influenced countless others working in this field, including myself. He remains actively involved in the association, and his crucial role in establishing the ground for Italian-Canadian writing, as we know it, can hardly be overstated. The critical work that Pavato did depended significantly on those early works of Italian-Canadian writing being published. No one was more important to getting that work published than Antonio D'Alfonso. In 1978, he established Guernica Press. For the next 32 years, until 2010, he published works, about 450 in total by his count, that more mainstream publishers would not embrace, including many works by Italian-Canadian writers. Antonio represented a kind of renegade spirit. He was in some ways the embodiment of what Pavato was claiming, that there is a message in this writing, that it is a different voice, and that it should be heard. Sometimes he was irascible, difficult, but Antonio was okay with that perception. He took chances. He did what had to be done to ensure that good writers saw their work in print, even or especially if they were not mainstream. At the same time, D'Alfonso developed his own voice as a leading critic of what he calls the Italic condition. His work takes many forms: poetry, essays, editorials, novels, films. As a Canadian born in Montreal to Italian immigrant parents, educated and immersed in French-Canadian culture, he poses penetrating questions about the nature of Italian culture as it exists and is transformed when it migrates outside of Italy. He wrestles with questions of identity and language. D'Alfonso and Pasquale Verdicchio were foils to each other in testing and articulating their ideas about the place of Italic writing in North America. In 2010, he left publishing, completed his PhD. He now writes, teaches, and translates, and continues to be a provocative voice on important issues in the arts and culture. If D'Alfonso may be said to symbolize something of the renegade spirit that was required to establish the ground of Italian-Canadian writing, Pier Giorgio Di Cicco is clearly its guiding light, its mystical shaman. Di Cicco's anthology, Roman Candles, was a watershed when it was published in 1978. I think of it as the first whale from the crib. As he noted, all involved were inspired by the anthology itself. It put an end to the aforementioned isolationism. That comment provides a useful insight into Di Cicco's overarching motivation in life, namely, to close the gap, to bring people together, to promote real community and genuine civility as a counterforce to rampant individualism. Like D'Alfonso, Di Cicco has worn many hats. He was the editor of Books in Canada. He has taught, published more than 20 volumes of poetry. He was the poet laureate of Toronto, and in the 1990s he took religious orders and was ordained a Catholic priest. Di Cicco's gift is to move seamlessly between the micro and the macro. He challenges our notions of citizenship and belonging, civility and creativity, and he is deeply moved by his own Italianità, an Italian aesthetic sensibility that he knows to be a part of his core. So he asks the big questions. What kind of society do we want? How do we achieve it? Who is responsible? How do we go about creating it? Politicians, individuals, civic leaders? In 2007, ZUCCHERO published Municipal Mind, Manifestos for the Creative City, a synopsis of his thinking about the civic aesthetic, a term coined to define building a city by citizenship, civic ethic, and urban psychology. The reflections in that manifesto resonate with sentiments expressed in his inspired volumes of poetry, The Honeymoon Wilderness in 2002 and The Dark Time of Angels, 2003. The creative and the critical are no strangers to each other in Pier Giorgio's writing. In fact, to suggest they could exist apart from each other would seem anathema to him. Apart from his own prolific output, Pier Giorgio has had a strong and enduring influence on the development of many other writers, including Mary Di Michele and Maria Scarcio Andrews, just two award-winning writers. His mission is to shape things up, to prod us to see things anew and imagine new possibilities. I see in his writing what Martha Nussbaum praises as the highest and most vital function of the arts, literature, poetry, and philosophy, namely, the promotion of global citizenship. Writing in Duologue in 1998, Pasquale Verdicchio suggested that Italian-Canadian writers have to become activists. ZUCCHERO's writing and his public presence, his life of service, are one prime example of such activism. Part 2, the shift. Antonio D'Alfonso is quoted as saying, "If there is a future for our community, it is in the presence of women intellectuals and artists." History may prove Antonio correct on this count. Of course, women participated at the very earliest stages of the AICW coming together. Anna Foschi Ciampolini and Venera Fazio have written about those events. If we consider the volume and caliber of Italian-Canadian writing produced in recent years, I would assert that women writers have risen to the forefront of this movement. They have provided leadership in the association, organized public events and readings, and produced arguably much of the best writing. The publication Pillars of Lace in 1999 was an important milestone on this trajectory. Earlier this year, Exploring Voice, Italian-Canadian Female Writers, was released as the latest chapter in the saga. Notably, it combines creative works and critical essays that articulate the contribution these writers are making both within Italian-Canadian writing and beyond it. I find further evidence for the predominance of women writers in the announcements that I receive regularly about reading events and salotti. Examples would be the Not-So-Nice Italian Girls and Friends, an event presented in Toronto where 15 Italian-Canadian women presented their poetry and comedy. Bloodlines, readings by Italian daughters and fathers to celebrate Italian Heritage Month. And Gianna Patriarca's reading All My Fallen Angelas at the Istituto Italiano di Cultura in Toronto. In recent years, members of the supporting chorus have taken leading roles in providing the three key ingredients: the tireless hard work, the renegade spirit, and the mystic sensibility. On the relationship between criticism and creative writing, let me return to the assertion I made earlier, that this relationship is important to understanding the development of Italian-Canadian writing as a whole. Clearly, there is much more creative writing than analysis of it. Why? What resides in this point? The short answer, of course, is there are simply many more writers than critics. Should this be a concern? One recurring motif at our conferences has been that our work is not recognized sufficiently, that we don't get our due, that we are not appreciated sufficiently. Is this true? Why is critical response to our writing so important? A few reflections on this issue. First, I think we must reject as a false binary the notion that creative work and criticism are separate or somehow opposed to one another. They are not. In fact, the reverse is true. The best and most insightful criticism is inherently creative work. It explains and explores key features of works of art in ways that we might not have apprehended. It connects the work of art to important contemporary issues and other works of art. So it helps us comprehend the creative act or work more fully and appreciate it more deeply. Conversely, the most engaging creative works always include a strong measure of critical incisiveness about individual characters and their motivations, about families and their complex dynamics, or whole societies, nations, and the human condition. Here, the issue of self-reflexivity arises, and this is a conundrum. It is an awkward truism that critics of Italian-Canadian writing are mostly Italian-Canadian writers. The balance has improved slightly since the early days, but the problem persists. In the 1980s and 90s, it was a very small group involved. Often, the same people who were producing creative works were conducting much of the critical analysis. The circle has expanded, but the issue remains, and it's a catch-22. If we don't do this work, who will? But we are perceived as insiders at best, or cheerleaders at worst, lacking in objectivity. So does our cultural awareness enhance our perceptions or contaminate our judgments? Or could it be both? Why is criticism important, especially criticism from outside of our group? Or is it? Why not just focus on creating good new works of art, good poems and novels and film scripts? Because critical analysis is a marker of being taken seriously by the Academy if our works are included in the curriculum and taught, by public at large if our works are reviewed in newspapers, magazines, journals, and on websites and social media. Literary awards have become another important marker of acceptance and esteem, for better or worse. The public profile that arises from criticism creates awareness, curiosity, and demand for what we do. That, in turn, supports the distribution, circulation, and sale of our works. After all, even artists must eat. Does more criticism mean better criticism? Not necessarily, but the more critical work that is produced, the greater likelihood some of it will be good. As Gundula Wilk noted in her 2003 review in Canadian literature, if the contribution of these ethnic writers to Canadian literature are ignored by general readers, by teachers and critics, or if they are merely subjected to stereotypical analysis, a major part of our culture in Canada is silenced or misrepresented, and the focus remains limited on the dominant groups. Nothing develops without effective criticism. The reciprocity between these two in Italian-Canadian writing has enhanced the development of both. In conclusion, I would like to turn to the theme of this conference: departures, journeys, destinations. Migration was and remains for me at the very center of Italian-Canadian writing. Over the course of the 20th century, Italians departed from Italy in record numbers and transplanted themselves around the world. They journeyed to lands unknown and have had to reinvent themselves. As Italians abroad, they have had to learn new languages, understand other cultures, and adapt to different milieux. They have made a difference everywhere they settled. In America, including Canada, in Argentina, in Australia, and that's just the A part of the alphabet. In migrating from their homeland, many Italians came to understand what is essential to them and what they cherish most: the freedom to pursue their goals and embrace their identity. In adjusting to life in foreign places, they also came to appreciate firsthand the difficulties of that experience for every migrant. Writing about that journey has put us in touch with something deep, vital, and universal. Ironically, Italians are now faced with the most compelling and challenging questions around how to respond humanely and responsibly to the greatest migration in human history, a refugee crisis of stunning proportions that is breaking on Italian shores as we speak. Recently it was reported that the world's refugee population has soared to an all-time record 63.5 million people, according to the latest UNHCR reports. But much of the world is increasingly responding with xenophobia, divisive rhetoric, closed borders, and political paralysis. Donald Trump and Brexit would be just two examples. The destination for each writer is a different one. Some write to reconcile a difficult past. Some to better understand their Italian heritage and how it affects them. Some write to try to know themselves better and their world. All are better for having written. Pier Giorgio De Chico has said, the primal desires of the human spirit are desires for delight and creativity. These desires meet in moments of wonder, when people of different nationalities and ideologies share a moment of wonder together. And that wonder spills over and makes for trust and reciprocity and mutuality. So finally, does it matter that Italian-Canadian writing should survive, or better still, flourish? I think it does matter, and perhaps it matters more now than ever before, because the world is getting smaller day by day. Globalization is ubiquitous. Our capacity to accept, embrace, and celebrate this cultural diversity is more critical now than ever before. I firmly believe that the arts, and especially good writing, can play an important role in helping us to manage these difficult challenges. Martha Nussbaum makes this point eloquently in her 2010 book, Not for Profit: Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. She writes, "We live in a world in which people face one another across gulfs of geography, language, nationality. The problems we need to solve, economic, religious, political, are global in their scope. They have no hope of being solved unless people once distant come together and cooperate in ways they have not before." She talks about teaching intelligent world citizenship and emphasizes the role of education, and especially the arts and humanities, in cultivating the understanding needed to meet these challenges. I would assert that Italian-Canadian writing, in its many diverse forms, has much to teach us about the capacity for literature to do some of this work. I think the writers in this community, the work they have done, the literature they have produced over the past 30 years, provide a wonderful example of what can be accomplished where there is a willingness to work tirelessly against difficult obstacles, a bit of renegade spirit, and a mystic spirit that refuses to be quelled. Thank you very much. Grazie.